Hello and welcome to the first episode of the Wealth Group for Women. I'm very honored to be here today with Mr. John Truman Wolfe. You're going to hear from him for a solid 40 minutes regarding his book, The Crisis by Design. I've read this book twice and I'm on my third time through. Mr. Wolfe exposes in this book exactly who took your money in 2008 and what's coming, another crash, so that you can prevent what's coming and also protect your assets, protect your retirement, and raise your financial IQ. Now let's go to Mr. John Truman Wolfe.
I was a banker in San Francisco and then later in Beverly Hills some time ago. When I became a banker, I took an interest in the international financial organizations that were formed after after the Second World War, actually towards the end of the Second World War, 1944. Later, I formed a financial management company in Los Angeles with my partner. I'm pretty much retired from that now. I am retired from that now. And I'm writing, but for some years I was overseeing the financial investment matters of major names in Hollywood, and so I had to stay very plugged into it. So one, I had background as a banker, then as essentially a financial and money manager, a business manager really, and then I just kept writing about it, and that's how the book came into fruition. When I became a banker, I took an interest in the international financial organizations that were formed after after the Second World War, actually towards the end of the Second World War, 1944. At Bretton Woods, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were established at that time. Those organizations were designed to the IMF to kind of keep currencies in balance, and the World Bank to provide loans for war-torn Europe. Those were their purposes at that time. They have morphed into and developed into organizations that are extremely oppressive to governments of the world. And so I started following them. I started noticing this, I started researching them and reading about them, and I started following them. And I could see the plan that they were implementing on various countries, the programs that they implemented. It was staggering me to watch this go on and on. Nobody was really doing anything about it, and I started writing about it. I wrote some articles about it. In 1998, there was something called the Asian flu. I say something, this was a financial crisis that developed, ran down the Asian continent into Thailand and then into Indonesia. And I watched this because I could see the IMF at work here, and what essentially they do, these folks, they send in a currency trader, and George Soros is often the front man here for these organizations, and he will short sell the country's currency. Now, for your listeners and viewers who don't understand short selling, it's basically a bet against a commodity or a stock. In other words, you're betting that it's going to go down without getting overly technical about it. And Soros, a billionaire, has enough financial clout that he sells massive amounts of the country's currency, and because there are not enough buyers for it, supply and demand, the value of the currency goes down. And when the value of the currency goes down, the country then has difficulties in international trade, in their economy. People go out of work, get out of work. There are riots, civil commotion, and so forth and so on. These are planned financial crises. They don't just happen. They are planned. So here you have these countries, and Indonesia is a great example. I said in '98, which is what, 12 years ago now. But if somebody goes back and studies that and looks at the so-called Asian flu as it ran through Asia and down into Indonesia, you can see this develop. So the IMF and the World Bank then come in on their white horses. You know, they ride in on a white horse and they say to the premier or the president or whoever's running the place, you know, you have a problem? Would $5 or $10 billion help? Invariably, they would say yes. Now, I say invariably. I have watched some premiers or people running countries say no. I was in Russia a great deal right after the fall of communism, and I watched this game, this plan be run on Russia. And they crashed the ruble, and the IMF came in to Boris Yeltsin, and they went, you know, you need some help here, you know, we'll lend. And he was like, I'm not going to get Western bankers into Russia. And he, you know, did this 4 times. They came back, and each time the ruble got worse and the economy got worse. And finally, you know, Boris took a slug of vodka and went, okay, where do I sign? And the where do I sign is what's important here. Because once the country agrees to take the help from these international financial institutions, they have to sign a loan agreement. And I've read these loan agreements, and they are extremely restrictive, controlling social policies, tax policy, agricultural policy, what girls are taught in school about family planning, population control kinds of things. These are very, very oppressive. And there's about 3/4 of the planet that is indebted now to these world financial institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, as a result of these kinds of things. And mostly third world countries, African nations, South American nations, and so forth, some Asian nations. And so that's how they operated. This, if one studies them and watches the history of the IMF and the World Bank, you'll see this occur. There's a guy who wrote a book that did very well, John Perkins, Confessions of an International Hitman, Economic Hitman, I think it was called, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Very good book. And this is a guy that was on the ground representing the World Bank and the IMF. It doesn't have a full strategic point of view, but this is a guy that was doing this kind of stuff. So I was following this stuff for years. All of a sudden, as the financial crisis started to materialize, late 2007, early 2008, I read an article in the Wall Street Journal by the then president of the New York Fed. And that article called for what was referred to as a GMA, a Global Monetary Authority. I'd never heard this term before. I'd never heard the acronym GMA. I'd never heard the term Global Monetary Authority. I started researching, and a GMA is basically a financial dictator for the planet. That's what one is. And I went, oh, here they come. Here they come. They've now done it, this in Africa and South America and so forth and so on. The United States is now in their target. And so I started researching and writing. And of course, the president of the New York Fed, I say of course, some people may not remember, the president of the New York Fed in March of 2008 was Timothy Geithner, who is now the U.S. Secretary of Treasury. But it became clear to me when the president of the New York Fed wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal calling for a global monetary authority that was the intention of the people playing these kinds of games. And then I wrote about it. I predicted that a global monetary authority would be put in place. And in fact, shortly after I wrote that article, indeed, in April 2009, April 2nd, 2009, a global monetary authority was put in place. Most people don't know this at all, which is kind of the story of the book. but on April 2nd, the G20 met in London. G20 are the 20 most powerful governments in the country, and they meet on financial matters. They met in London, and they signed into existence an entity called the Financial Stability Board, which is an entity that has been placed inside of a bank in Basel, Switzerland, the Bank for International Settlements. And that entity is now dictating to the central banks of the world. Central banks, as your viewers may well know, and if they don't, I will tell them, print money. They create the money and control the interest rates of countries. So if you are dictating to the central banks, you're basically controlling the money supply and interest rates on the planet. That's a very long-winded answer to your question, but that's the development of my kind of study of this from a banking background,